It's Friday, the 25th of October, 2024.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Pod News Weekly Review with James Cridland and Sam Sethi.
Yes, I'm James Cridland here in Copenhagen in Denmark. Sam Sethi has just sent me a little message. He said that he is swimming in the sea. It's his daughter's idea, apparently. It's 13 Celsius here in Copenhagen. That's 55 Fahrenheit. He's here, but he's doing family things this week, so therefore will not be on this show. So we've got a special show for you and in the chapters today.
Hello, I'm Jack Sylvester, Executive Director at Flight Studio and Executive Director also of Diver CEO. And I'll be on later to talk about all things Diver CEO, innovations we're doing, new formats we're trying out, and everything in between.
He will. It's a great interview. It's up next. This podcast is sponsored by Buzzsprout with the tools, support and community to ensure you keep podcasting. Start podcasting, keep podcasting with Buzzsprout.com.
From your daily newsletter, the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's a special today because, well, this is a very interesting interview. The man who is in charge of a Diary of a CEO, the man who is also looking after a number of Stephen Bartlett's things. In this interview, he talks about longer format shows, shows that are video first. He talks about using data for Diary of a CEO as well, and what's next for Diary of a CEO, as well as their brand new launches, Flight Studio and Flight Books. The man's called Jack Sylvester. Sam Sethi explains who he is.
Jack is the Executive Director of Flight Studio. He also worked with Stephen Bartlett at the beginning of Diary of a CEO, which is one of the world's #1 podcasts. Jack, hello, how are you?
Hello, good. Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Now, Jack, you a couple of weeks ago were talking to Ashley Carman, friend of Pod News Weekly, about longer form podcasts. Now, I was surprised because I thought everyone was telling us that short form, 45-minute podcast, 30-minute podcast, short clips was the way forward. And yet here you are talking to Ashley about longer form podcasts. You were doing 9-hour podcasts. Lex Friedman's been doing longer ones. Joe Rogan's been doing longer ones. So let's start off with, why have you decided that longer form podcasts may be a better strategy for Diary of a CEO going forward?
Yeah, so it's not a super intentional strategy, if I'm honest. I would love to say that there's a huge strategization meeting that goes on, but really what it comes down to is the content great? Is what we're recording, do people want to hear it? And if they do, then it kind of goes out. So it's not a case of let's make these super long, because that's what we're seeing in the data. Like, if the content's really good, people will stick around. And you mentioned that there's these clips that you think people are more geared towards shorter content. Where in actual fact, I think there's an audience for both, and it's a behavior thing, right? So if you're walking around, and over the weekend, I actually moved house. So I had a podcast on, just doing everything. And I probably listened to like 4 or 5 hours of podcasts whilst moving stuff around. But this morning, I was having my breakfast and I'm just scrolling, and I'm not in the mood for listening to longer form, and I'm there for short form. So I think they both have their place. But for us, it's just, is the conversation good? Is our audience going to enjoy it? Does it bring value for them? And if it does, it stays in.
Yeah, I think the thing that really struck home for me was when I came to the Flight Studio launch last week. Stephen was talking about on stage was how you structure your shows, how you pick your guests, how you determine your clips. I didn't realize that it was such a data-driven way that you guys were producing podcasts. Now, what I'd like to do is break some of those down. So first of all, can you talk about how you go around picking your guests? Because that was quite interesting, the way that you use data to find the right people.
Yeah, so this is not like 100% my area, but I will talk on it as much as I can. Jemima and her guest booking team do a fantastic job here. So that's kind of their remit more than mine. But the general strategy is it's a 3-part formula, I guess. And it is Stephen interested in the topic? Is the guest the expert on a certain topic, and can they speak on it well? And then do the audience want to know about this topic? And if it hits 2, it doesn't go through. It has to hit all 3. So if Stephen's interested and they're the expert in their field, but the audience don't want it, it just doesn't go through. And then another strategy they also have is they look at outliers because we want to try and be the first interview. I think the person that Steve used on stage was Dr. Tara Swart. She is a proper outlier and all her interviews do quite well, but she's not a really well-known name. So we've started establishing this software and our own kind of tool about how we find guests like that, ones that not necessarily have a huge audience, but the podcasts they do go on, they outperform any other interviews on that channel. And it's a really complex strategy that Steve and Jem have made themselves. But yeah, it's everything we do is fully data driven for sure.
The other thing that was interesting as well was post-production. So let's say you've got a long form video and you've produced it. You don't just push that out straight away. You put that to a panel of people. So can you tell us more about how you use that panel?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. I think we actually developed this last Christmas. We had this guy, Rox, who is this amazing developer that me and Steve met maybe 3 years ago. He used to work for Mr. Beast, basically coding and making tools for him. And we got chatting and we eventually flew him over to London, and him and his friend Ian basically built this tool for us that essentially is a platform. So we have a pool of, I think it's about 300 people that are NDA'd, so they know what they're getting themselves into, and it's an episode that we haven't released, so we need to make sure that it's secure in that instance. But they get sent to a platform. This platform is super plain. You wouldn't get distracted by anything else. The main focus is the video. So it's not like YouTube where you have kind of suggested and all of that kind of stuff to distract you. But it shows them the video, and at the bottom it has a little button that says interesting, and you can go through the video, and if you find it interesting you can hit the space bar and it basically will give us on the back end a spike, and it shows, say 10 people watched it, it shows that 6 out of those 10 people found this particular section at 1 hour 40 super interesting. So on our side we'll look at that and we'll determine, obviously, like, you can't use it fully. A lot of the stuff that we do here is the data informs us, our decisions. It doesn't dictate the decisions, because a lot of stuff that people might find interesting or people don't find a certain section interesting, you can't just get rid of that because it might lack context for a section they do find interesting. So we ran that experiment with the interesting button for a bit, and then we sort of realized, well, maybe they're just actually listening to it and they're not watching it in a certain sense. Maybe they're just coming in and every time they hear an interesting bit, they do it. So then we further developed the tool. With their permission, we used their webcam. It's a pop-up that says, gives them a full description of why we want their webcam, what we're going to use it for, and you just press allow. And that webcam tracks their eyes. So it sees if their eyes are looking at the screen and fully engaged, or if they're off doing something else. So we have a green line that goes along the screen and a red line, and you can see it's a bit like a retention graph on what you'd see on maybe YouTube or Megaphone or any kind of stats where you have a long form episode. But yeah, that will show us basically a retention graph of full attention on the episode or not on the episode.
Wow. Okay. And as you said, it informs your decisions. Has that also informed your decision about longer form then? Going back to my original question, did that say, oh, people were engaged quite a long way through each podcast, our retention was really high. Actually, we can extend this further because actually the attention that they're giving us is not dropping off as quickly as we thought it might do.
Yeah, for sure. It is very episode dependent. Like you have someone, I think this piece that I spoke to Ashley about was the Andrew Huberman episode. And he is just someone that can just, he knows, his breadth of knowledge is insane. And he can talk on it really well, really clearly. And he has an audience and people just respect him and want to listen to him. So it's very guest dependent in that instance. But from the pre-watch data that we got, and then also when we put it out on YouTube, we are seeing a constant trend of people sticking around. And actually, we haven't put anything out with like a really bad guest. Like, we wouldn't put out like a raw episode where it's maybe a 3-hour long episode and it's condensed down to maybe an hour. Like, we've never done that. So we don't have the data to know if people would stick around anyway. But from what we are seeing is that the episodes we are thinking are valuable and people will find interesting, the data is showing us that people are sticking around and they want to see the longer form content from those individuals like Andrew Huberman, like Andy Galpin, like Dr. K, and they will stick around, and there's no sign of it slowing down, really.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm beginning to realise, looking at my 20-year-old children, I say children, young adults, is they use it as a modern day form of radio. So they will have long form video podcasts running in the background, and the minute that there's something interesting that they really want to lean into, they'll turn into the video and look at it, but they'll turn away and get on with other tasks. And it describes what you were just saying. You were moving boxes around yesterday and you had a long form podcast in the background. And that's what we used to do in the old days. We'd just leave the radio on in the background for company, for noise, but also occasionally there'll be something interesting to dip into. So I think maybe that's where long form podcasting is. Now, one of the things Stephen talked about and you and I mentioned briefly when we met was maybe a change up of the format for 2025. Can you tell us what your thoughts might be if you're going to make a difference to the Diary of a CEO?
Yeah, so this is something we're obsessing about at the moment. Is what we're doing correct? And are people going to stick around with us forever, or do we need to basically adjust our strategy and see if people are interested in something else? And I think we would be super naive to think that people are going to stick around with us forever. So it's something we always obsess about, not only in the formats, but everything we do is just constant experimentation and seeing if people are liking the current way we're doing things, or is there something we can do better? Because let's be honest, like everyone can always do stuff better. And we look at your big podcasters like your Humans, your Joe Rogans, and they've just done the same thing for years and it's working really well. But then we also think, like, is there a 18, 20-year-old in their bedroom right now creating something that we haven't thought about, those guys haven't thought about, that in 2 to 3 years' time is just going to completely overtake us, and we're just the analogy of the horses in the cars. I don't know if you've heard that one, where people put all their thoughts into horses and kind of disregarded this car because it was a expensive thing and they didn't think about it, and then the car overtook all the horses. So it's that kind of thing that we think about. I think the book's The Innovator's Dilemma.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. You're facing the innovator's dilemma, which is stick or twist. Stick with what works. Twist, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But you're right. It was Henry Ford who said, if I asked people what they wanted, they'd say faster horses. They wouldn't say they want a car. Yeah. So what are you thinking then? What are some of the experiments that you're thinking about that you might want to produce for Diary of a CEO?
So some of the things we're thinking about more, and we've actually started implementing in a less dramatic way, is B-roll. Obviously, that's more geared towards the video side of things, but just using B-roll more to give context to a certain topic or a certain story that someone might be talking about. In the Russ Cook episode that we put out a few months ago, we used a lot of his footage from his YouTube channel, and that just gives a lot of color and a lot of context to him in those moments and those instances that he's referring to in the podcast. Another thing, and actually it's an episode coming out on Thursday, we've got an episode with Anne McKee, who is a brain surgeon, neuroscientist, and she deals with people that have CTE. And with hers, we're thinking about incorporating more clips and potentially even some sort of music to elevate it. A lot of the old podcasters, they always use sound design and music, and they don't necessarily lean into the B-roll because video wasn't such a thing back then. But yeah, that's something that we're really thinking about. And Will, who runs our Behind the Diary, we're working with him on potentially readjusting the podcast to follow more of a documentary style format. So completely readjusting the structure of the conversation, going like really flat out, going completely far away. I think one of the things we don't want to do too much of is go so far left field that it's just not what people signed up for, because that is something you see as behaviors of people. They go to a channel because they know what they're getting. And if you completely flip that on its head, it might disrupt the status quo a little bit. That's not something that I think we could experiment with massively, but it's something that we could slowly ease into. So yeah, those are a few things that are top of mind for all of us, and me and my team are working in the background to see how we can develop that even further.
Yeah, Stephen talked about this thing called the 1%, which feels like what you're doing here is, can we make incremental change, a 1% change that will increase the audience. I think he mentioned about chairs and he mentioned about the CO2 in
Yeah.
the room. Can you tell me what he means by the chairs and the CO2?
Yeah, so I'm actually sitting on one of the chairs now in the DAX studio, but we've gone through a few iterations and we build the set every time we go to LA and New York. We build a replica set. And the first time we did it, the chairs that we have here weren't available in the States. So I went and bought chairs and they had arms on them. And after we realized that what the guest was doing was slouching down into the chair a lot more, leaning on the side and kind of just relaxing a bit too much. And one, it didn't look great on camera, but two, you could just feel their demeanor changing and the feeling of the conversation changing. So we changed it and we went back to chairs without arms. And the whole conversation just changed. Everyone's upright, they're fully engaged, they're not slouching and thinking about something else potentially. So when they say we had hours, it was probably hours upon hours upon hours debating these chairs. Between me, Steve, Georgie, and Jem, we just were obsessing about which chairs we could use, why a certain chair would lend itself to the conversation, why another one wouldn't. So that was the general crux of the chair conversation. The CO2 one came after we had James Nestor on the podcast, who wrote the book Breath. We're in this room here I'm in now. We've soundproofed it. So we have these soundproof doors that we shut. And after 2 or 3 hours, it does get quite hot in here. And you can feel the air's a little bit clammy. And then when James Nestor came on, he brought this little CO2 monitor with him. And he brought it out in the middle of the podcast. And he was like, I'm going to measure the CO2 levels in this room. And he left it on the side. And actually, you can see on the episode, I just put it down in the bottom right hand corner so people can see it. But then proceeded to talk about how the CO2 buildup in the air and the lack of oxygen coming into the room, your cognitive function starts slowing down a little bit. You get a little bit more sluggish. Your thoughts aren't flowing as well. So we realized that we needed to find a way to filter the air in the room. So now we run the air conditioning and as low as possible because it's not great for microphones, but I think there's a nice balance to have between the two. And that just filters the air. And you can literally feel, after the James Nestor conversation, we did it, and the air is just fresher, you feel sharper. So yeah, those are the two things that Steve was referring to on stage. And I think it probably sounds a bit weird that we would think about like CO2 and chairs, but after I just explained it, I'm sure you can see how much of an impact it would have on the conversation and the episode as a whole.
Now, you mentioned Davina and Paul. That's Flight Studio. And Flight Studio, I think, needs to be explained because Diary of a CEO was a standalone podcast that you worked with Stephen on. But now you've brought Georgie Holt and Christiana B, and they've come in to start Flight Studio. So just give me, what is Flight Studio and what are some of the new podcasts that you guys are working on?
Yeah, so Flight Studio is, at its essence, it's a podcast growth platform that we've started building, and it's taking the tools that we've used to build Diary of a CEO, the knowledge we've used to build Diary of a CEO, and the philosophy as well that we've used, and a little bit that I've touched on previously. And we are bringing that across these other shows. And similar to the data conversation, we are using hosts that have been outperformers on the Diary of a CEO. So we've got Davina McCall, Paul Brunson, Tara Swart, Africa Brooke, and Kristen Holmes, and each one of those has been an outperformer. They can speak really well in their field, and they're just got an audience that respect and want to hear about their opinion. So we're bringing those guys in, and we started with Paul. He was a bit of a guinea pig for us, and he's the perfect guinea pig because he's just the most relaxed, malleable, chilled out guy. So lovely. So he was our first podcast that we released with Lauren Goodger. And that did really well. And yes, it's using everything that we've learned over the past 4 or 5 years with Diary of a CEO and implementing it into the other shows in their own tailored way.
And so I guess that's what Flight Studio is. It's taking your format, using your tools, and then enabling that growth for other people.
Yeah. But I would say that one thing we did realize with Paul Brunson's We Need to Talk is taking the format, the exact way we do things, and putting it into another host doesn't quite work as you would sort of expect because he's a different person. In hindsight, it's very obvious, but he's a different person. He has his own way of working. He has his own thoughts and feelings about how he wants to run the show. So that is one big lesson for us. It's not just a case of copying and pasting the format, and you do have to make slight adjustments as the host comes in. And we started developing more tools and more strategies to try and build on that. But yeah, it's been a huge learning curve and super interesting.
Now, talking of guests, because you've been with Stephen from the beginning, who's been your favourite guest?
Yeah, so it kind of does change, and each one of them is amazing in their own individual ways. I've got two, and I've got two different answers, and I think one might be quite shocking. But the first one that always pops into my mind is Mo Gaudat, episode 101, the first time he came on. And he came on to talk about his book, Scary Smart, which is AI. And Steve didn't really want to talk about it at the time, so he changed it to his first book, which is about happiness. And he had a son that was a kind of Buddhist monk, and he wanted to try and make the world a happier place. And his son died in a routine operation. And at the time, Mo was working at Google X, which is the innovation department of Google. And he decided to quit his corporate job and carry on his son's work. And that episode, it was just so impactful, like the responses we got from it. He approaches happiness from a very analytical and engineering perspective from his time at Google X. And yeah, that one really sticks in my mind. We've had him on 3 times since, and now we've actually spoken about Scary Smart, the AI one, which is quite interesting because at the time we were like, no one really cares about AI. And then 2 years later or a year later, he came back on to talk about it, and that one did better than the first one. So very, like, timing's everything, right? And then the second answer is actually Matt Hancock, and not because the conversation and not because the guest as a whole, but it's what that conversation did for us as a platform. It shifted us from a podcast where we kind of have conversations to a place where the conversations that people want to hear happen. And since then, we've had Boris Johnson on, and the Matt Hancock one really sticks in my mind as one that shifted us in the public eye from just a podcast to a place where conversations happen. So yeah, those are my 2 answers, and I could probably talk forever on certain episodes to why they're my favorite, but those are the 2 I always go back to.
I think the first one is, whenever anyone talks about happiness, I always ask the question, the founding fathers of America said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It wasn't money. And I think that's the thing that people seem to sometimes forget, that happiness is such a goal to strive for rather than just a pure pursuit of money. And so I will go back and listen to that episode.
I was just going to say, like, it's such an interesting word, happiness, because everyone has such a weird perception of what it means and how you get happy. And everyone has a different answer to what makes you happy, because it's always like the little things or it's stuff that happens in life. But Mo just encapsulates it in a really tangible way. And he has this like formula, and it all basically comes down to expectations. He talks about how if your expectations aren't met, then you're unhappy. So if you kind of reduce your expectations and just take life as it is, then everyone would be much more satisfied.
I read a book many years ago, which I highly recommend to everybody to read. It's a short form book by Viktor Frankl. It's called In Search of Meaning. Read that book and you will put your expectations at a certain point for yourself. It is one of the most amazing books I've ever read. Anyway, we digress. The Matt Hancock thing, I think, is really interesting because with the US presidential election going on, you're seeing Trump and you're seeing Kamala Harris now going on to podcast shows. And Obama was seen as a social media president. You know, he reached out to social media, and Trump and Harris are now using podcasting as a vehicle to get to different generations of people. I could imagine that Diary of a CEO going forward will have, as you said, you've had Boris, you've had others. I can see that sort of evolution of where people who want to reach wide audiences aren't going to what we used to call mainstream media, because mainstream media now is becoming the podcast. So again, I can see why the Hancock one would be such a significant one as a change in the perception of what people think of you.
Yeah, and it's probably also worth noting that when we brought him on, he had just resigned as health secretary during COVID. So it was a very pivotal moment. It was someone that was front and center, basically telling us to, hands, face, space, I think was what he kept saying on TV. And then he was caught having a relationship with his, I think I was his PA or something like that. So basically just going against all his own rules. So it was at a time when everyone in media wanted to talk to him, and he particularly picked us because we're there to listen. We're there to ask him the hard questions, and what happened with Boris as well. We're there to ask the questions, but we're not going to got you questions like the mainstream media seem to do and catch you out and try and make you look foolish. We kind of just try and let them speak as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that is often the right way to do it, because I think if you are there just to get that gotcha clip, which they know that if you go to mainstream news outlets, they have to get that clip because they've only got 30 seconds of TV to throw that out. And so they're hunting for that gotcha moment. Whereas in a long form, even if you do say something stupid within the context of a longer podcast, it probably is okay. Now, a couple of other things that I wanted to catch up on, which was Flight Books. Now, that was at the announcement. I was totally left fielded on that. Why Flight Books? Why are you getting into book publication?
So I think the feeling around Flight Books is Steve's released his first book, Happy Sexy Millionaire. And I know he hates that title because it's basically just like everything that he set out to achieve. And he got all of those things. And I guess the sexy one's a bit subjective, but he achieved all those things and realized that it wasn't it. And the whole book's kind of about that. But when going through that process, and then he also released another one, The Diary of a CEO, and it's all of the lessons he's learned from Diary of a CEO. But going through the process of creating a book, he realized that book publishing is just very outdated. And it's a really horrible process to go through. The marketing they want to do around it, the reason they pick a cover, he just couldn't get over how sluggish the whole industry is and how it's not innovated or changed in however many years it's been running. So he just wanted to disrupt that space, and he wanted to bring a new approach to the industry that's not being taken on by anyone else. And the thinking is, if he makes it easier for people and less of a sluggish process, then we might get better books.
I don't disagree that the book industry needs to be reinvented. I was just surprised, given that you are a podcast production company, that you didn't go through and just say, look, we're not going to produce hardbacks or paperbacks. We're just going to produce audiobooks.
Yeah, well, it's still going to be a huge thing for us, the audiobook side of things. But it does seem that people still like to buy books, and people use it as a bit of a trophy, I think, from what we have semi-discovered is that the title means a lot. And having the book on your bookshelf with that title, Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson, that Steve always refers to, but it just says something about you. And I think people still quite like that. I think people also want to come away from media as much and still have something quite tangible. So we're going to lean into both. We're not going to completely disregard audio, but I think we probably have a stronger stance on audio, to be honest, because that's kind of where we're at. But the physical book still has a place in the market, and we want to maintain that and potentially disrupt and make it better.
I've got a lot of friends who've produced books, and often they say it's their business calling card, because once you've produced a book, it feels like you're a much more of a grown-up person. People take you more seriously at speaker events. Not that I think Stephen needs a book to do that, but I think it's interesting, the psyche of having, I think it's also the same with podcasts. When you say you've got a podcast and it's got longevity, people then have that gravitas towards you that says, oh yeah, actually, I'd like to come on your podcast, or yeah, I've seen other people and therefore I'll come with you. So I think it's interesting, the psyche of books. I'm not a big book reader. I don't actually read books. I just listen to audiobooks because I just don't have the time, but we'll see. Now,
yeah, I'm exactly the same.
Yeah. I just don't know when I would find time to sit down for 4 or 5 hours to get into a book. But my wife does. She reads tons of books. So maybe there is a market for it. Now, lastly, talking about disruption, the one thing that Stephen talked about was Flightcast as a new element of the group. So can you tell me more about what Flightcast is and what you're doing with Spotify?
Yeah, so Flightcast is a podcast distribution platform similar to what Megaphone, Anchor, there's hundreds. So it's that basically. And for anyone that doesn't know, I'm sure everyone who listens to this probably does know, this platform takes an RSS feed and you upload your episode to that with the title and description and everything you want to show. And that distributes it to places like Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, everywhere you can kind of listen to podcasts. But every single one we've used, I think since I've been here, we've changed 4 times. and each one just like hasn't been it, and it doesn't have the data. They're not really leaning into video the way that we feel like they should be, and all of our efforts are really geared towards YouTube because the data's there. You can see why your audiences are listening, where they're coming from, how long they're listening for, if they're getting into the suggested, and there's just so much data there that it's just a treasure trove of data and information that helps us build on the next episode and then the next episode, and it just keeps going. And it's just not the same in audio. So we decided to build our own. And Rox, who I mentioned at the beginning, who built the tracking software, he is with his team in San Francisco. He's got a little team around it and he's building that out. I don't want to say it's like a full replica, but it's kind of trying to get to the point of what YouTube data is showing you. And we want to make sure that you can get the same data on audio that you can on YouTube, because it can just develop your show so much better. And one of the big things that the other platforms don't do, and I think the only one that does it is Anchor and Megaphone. It's not called Anchor anymore. It's called Spotify for podcasters, but they are the only ones, as far as I'm aware. I think when we spoke before that Apple also do this, but they distribute video on their platform. Apple sounds like it's not as widely known, but it's something that we're trying to lean into. And the only way we could do it was getting in touch with Spotify. So Steve texted Daniel Ek and was just like, we're doing this thing. We really need your help to develop it further because we've hit a little bit of a roadblock. And he was up for it. And he says, I've seen how you guys build things. I see how you guys are developing the podcasting space, and we want to try and help you develop your product, and we'll work with you as best we can. So yeah, they've basically given Rox all the details, but the back end of how to deliver video on Spotify, and we're rolling with it. And it's also got loads of other tools like an AI bot. So if you're someone that doesn't really know what you're looking at in terms of data, you can go on your AI bot and go, it's a bit like a chat GPT, I guess, but you can go on and go, hey, I saw a massive spike in January and then a massive dip in February. Could you tell me why that is? And one of the examples, they might say, well, you released loads of health episodes in January and everyone wants to rethink their health and start of a new year, new me type thing. So everyone was leaning in, and then you started producing, I don't know, neuroscience podcasts in February. So people started dropping off. And you can just start asking it questions to try and determine why your data is looking a certain way. And it will also give you suggestions. And we're also looking at doing A/B testing tools as well, which YouTube have just brought out on their platform. You've been able to do it for years on external platforms, but we're looking to try and bring that into audio so you can A/B test titles and descriptions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the use of AI is very interesting, and there are several hosts who've begun to use it, Captivate with Spark AI and Buzzsprout and Usha and Blueberry. So I think AI is good. I think becoming a host will be interesting. I think that's an audio initiative. I mean, obviously, the integration with Spotify, because Spotify, the way that it works now that I understand is that it allows you to manually update any video to your existing RSS feed, but it only plays back through Spotify. So it's not adding it to your RSS feed and redistributing it to other platforms. So I guess with Flightcast, what you'll be doing is adding the video element as a hosting element, but also one click to Spotify, which is cool. I guess you will also continue to add one click to YouTube. It won't be just for Spotify.
Well, we'll probably just keep them separate. Yeah, we'll continue doing what we're doing on YouTube. And it's interesting because when I talk to Rox about what he's developing, I see lots of potential for it. I think people could start using it as a different sort of platform to what we might intend it to be, because you've got a lot of content on YouTube and that's where people only post stuff. But what if you had a similar sort of interface that you could post that would also go on Spotify, where people start using it that aren't in the podcasting space? So yeah, that's something that I'm wondering as well.
And the interesting thing is what you're talking about is what we call first-party data. So when you're inside of YouTube, you can get that first-party data as the creator because you have a back-end access that gives you the retention rates. It gives you all sorts of other bits and pieces of data. You get that within Spotify and within Apple, but they're all disparate right now. And there is a third-party company called Bumper that is creating what I've called an attention dashboard, the ability to aggregate all of that into one place. It'll be interesting to see how you're going to be able to get that first party data when you're a host, because the first-party data is owned by the app, not by the host. So it'll be interesting to see what your plans are and how you manage to get that data back, unless you have a deal with Spotify that says they will give you that data back and therefore you can aggregate that.
Yeah, that's something I'm not fully clued up on, I'm afraid. That I'll have to, you'll have to interview Rox for that one.
Look, Jack, thank you so much. It sounds really exciting what's going on at Flight Group. I mean, with Flight Studio, Flight Books, Flight Cast, I'm sure there'll be other flights coming down the road as well. When will this new Diary of a CEO format start to roll out? When would be the first episode that we might see with something like that?
So we're already kind of developing it, but the first one incorporating a lot of B-roll will be on Thursday the 24th. And that's just using a bit more B-roll. And we've actually started doing our own animations in it as well and using clips and stuff like that. So that'll be geared much more towards the video side of things. But in the next sort of few months, we're actually going to start releasing a new episode actually of Diary of a CEO, which is going back to the roots a bit more of Diary of a CEO. We'll start incorporating the new format on that, and that will be audio only to start with.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, in the next couple of months, so very imminent.
Exciting. Jack Sylvester, thank you so much. Congratulations on all the success of Diary of a CEO. I bet 4 years ago when Stephen first knocked on your door and said, hey, do you want to do this with me? I doubt you thought you would be where you are today. But congratulations. It's been a ride, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's been a proper journey. And no, I definitely wasn't expecting to sort of be where we are now. But it's been super amazing. And I actually remember sitting with Steve in the kitchen. I think we'd done like two or three episodes, and just looked at me and was like, we've got something here, you know, we've got something here. And I always remember that moment because it was just so like casually said, but we really believed in it at the time, and we had no one listening. And not that it's really changed how we feel about the podcast, but it's amazing to see how many people it impacts and how many people it touches.
Jack Sylvester, thanks so much. Take care, mate.
Thank you so much.
The Pod News Weekly Review with Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
Just a quick shout out to our magnificent 11, Neil Velio, Rocky Thomas, Jim James, David Marsell, Cy Jobling, Rachel Corbett, Dave Jackson, Mike of the Road Media Network, Matt Medeiros, Marshall Brown and Cameron Moll. It's very good to meet Neil Velio for the first time on Wednesday. I was at the Independent Podcast Awards. No, we didn't win anything. We were nominated, but we didn't win anything. Yes, very good to see Neil there, and indeed everybody else. Just as a reminder, if you do support this show, then it goes to Sam and me. It doesn't go to any other part of the Pod News empire. So you can either hit that boost button and give us some of your lovely sats, or give us some of your lovely money through your MasterCard or your Visa card. That would be lovely. Or indeed, American Express is also accepted, and Eurocard, which apparently is still a thing. Anyway, go to weekly.podnews.net for that. My week, in case you're wondering, has been an awful lot of travel. Going all over the place. Norway, Sweden, here in Denmark, and in London as well. Yesterday, I met the folks from Hindenburg Journalist Pro, as it was called, Hindenburg Pro, as it is now called. And they were talking about their plans for the future. But unfortunately, it was done with a beer or two, or three, and that means that I can't talk about it, but it was very good to meet them, so excellent to meet both Preben and Nick, so skål to you both, and hopefully we will see you soon. And that's it for this week. All of the stories covered in this podcast were taken from the Pod News Daily newsletter. I mean, not that we really covered any stories, not quite sure why I've read that bit. Anyway, you can subscribe to the newsletter at podnews.net. Longer interviews, normally, in the Pod News Extra podcast. You'll also find me in Swedish this week. You can find those wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the show by streaming sats. You can give us feedback using the Buzzsprout fan mail link in our show notes. You can send us a boostergram or become a power supporter like the Magnificent 11 at weekly.podnews.net. Our music's from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D. And we're hosted and sponsored by Buzzsprout. Start podcasting. Keep podcasting.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show. And support us. The Pod News Weekly Review will return next week. Keep listening.